Well, Eskom will have to implement even more severe stages of load shedding as winter fast approaches, with plans allegedly in place right up to stage 16. For now, though, stage 6 of power cuts will continue indefinitely, according to Electricity Minister Kgosientso Ramakgopa. President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africans will be the first to know if the electricity grid fails. He said government had multiple plans in place in the event of a total grid breakdown, and that load shedding was unavoidable to avert a complete blackout. Well, to weigh in on these recent developments, I'm joined by Dr. Muller, who's a senior researcher fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Muller, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report this morning. Just how bad is this year's load shedding crisis when compared to last year? 2022 was touted a record high when it came to power cuts, but it does seem we're in the month of May and we've experienced more days of no power spent in the dark than before.
Yes, thanks very much for having me. I didn't take a look at the most recent statistics before this interview, but it is indeed the case that in the recent months we have had, South Africa has had a lot more higher stage load shedding than in previous years. I mean, I don't think that this is something that would be news to most South Africans because they're experiencing it on a daily and weekly basis.
Right. And while we're still waiting for Eskom to update the nation with regards to what the winter months are likely to look like, we're hearing all sorts of stages being punted out here. We've heard a possibility of stage 10 power cuts. We've seen drafts of potential stage 16 of power cuts. The word from the National Rationalized Specifications, the NRS, is that making way or paving the way for higher stages of load shedding is simply a prudent measure. But from your perspective, do you think we're really en route or on track to dealing with stage 10 power cuts?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is that load shedding is essentially the responsible way of managing the gap between demand and supply. So it's good to have load shedding plans because if you don't have them, that's when the grid collapses. And that's the worst possible scenario. So everything possible needs to be done in order to avoid that. The different stages of load shedding reflect effectively the extent of the gap between demand and supply. So a responsible government needs to prepare for all possible scenarios. That means the possibility of a grid collapse, but also everything in between. And if that means up to stage 16 load shedding, then so be it. Of course, the hope has to be that that is not necessary, but certainly it's necessary to have the plans in place, because if you don't, then you're going to get a grid collapse effectively unnecessarily, because you could have avoided it by rationing energy to electricity users.
Yeah. Part of the problem that has been mentioned by Eskom spokesperson Daphne Mokoena is the fact that South Africa is not introducing any new forms of energy when it comes to the grid. And of course, we're also experiencing these higher demands for energy as we go into the winter months. How best could government have dealt with this particular problem to avert, going to stage 16, for instance, of load shedding?
Well, I was under the impression in this interview we're going to be talking about Andre de Ruyter and these issues about investigations into Eskom, the gathering of intelligence and that kind of thing. But on the issue of load shedding per se, what could the government do to avoid the situation? Well, it could have invested in generation capacity back when it was told it needed to in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and it didn't do so. So it depends how far back you want to go. We can go that far back. A better job could have been done with Medupi and Kusile, the two large coal-fired power stations. Instead of the corruption and inefficiency that was involved in those, they could have been delivered at lower cost, which means that we would have all of those units running, and potentially that would at least save the country a number of stages of load shedding, perhaps load shedding altogether. But there are other problems with the older coal-fired power plants. Many critics say the government should have introduced more rapid renewable energy generation into the system. There's some merit to that argument, but unfortunately the argument for renewable energy has also been oversold. doesn't recognize the limitations of the grid, for instance, the additional costs that come with expanding grid capacity and so forth. So there are various things that the government definitely could have done and certainly should have done. South Africa should not be in this situation, but given that we are, given that we're in the situation where there hasn't been sufficient investment in capacity, there was corruption and inefficiency in these new build programs and so forth, it becomes a little bit more tricky to say, is the government doing well enough given all those past failures? But certainly having the plans in place is a necessary step.
Yeah, and I suppose for South Africans or viewers watching this conversation, I think the question for them is whether or not we should be applying more pressure on government for more answers on what a complete collapse of the power grid would look like. Are we talking about several days? Are we talking about several weeks? Because it does appear that the picture isn't quite clear for a lot of South Africans, even though we have these weekly energy updates from the electricity minister.
Well, let's talk about applying pressure to the government. So, I mean, there's been this court case recently. The High Court judge ruled that the government was obliged to provide electricity to various kinds of institutions, schools, hospitals, and so forth. That's being taken on appeal. I think I did an interview with one of your colleagues previously where I said that court action was misplaced. I don't think the government is deliberately dragging its feet in terms of addressing load shedding. One could say that maybe it's being inefficient. Certainly the fact of having all these different ministers is a problem. I'm not convinced about the appointment of an electricity minister to try and kind of herd the other ministers into some kind of coordinated action. So there's no issue of putting pressure on the government. What does it mean? But in this particular case, I'm a strong believer in transparency. If the government has plans in place to deal with the potential of a complete grid collapse, why not put those into the public domain? Having said that, I think we can be fairly certain that it's going to be the potential scenarios are pretty bad. As I understand it, and I'm sure you can find other people who from Eskom who can talk to these technical matters. But essentially, we may need another country to help us restart the grid. It would be at least a number of days, and that could be pretty catastrophic when you think about cellular networks, you think about water pumping, all these sorts of things. So it would be a disastrous situation regardless of how good the government's plan was. And that's why it's really important to avoid it, even if it means implementing something like stage 10 or stage 16 load shedding. That would still be better than an entire grid collapse. But of course, hopefully, it won't be necessary to go up to these higher stages.
Yeah. You mentioned transparency, and, President Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned that South Africans would be the first to know if indeed the country was to experience a complete collapse of the power grid. And yet we know that with all things pertaining to Eskom, it's all really been happening in secret, not out in the open. Part of the reason why private investigations were instituted to look into what's really happening at Eskom because of all the smoke and mirrors with regards to the truth or how deep, at least, the rot goes. Can South Africans really trust the word of a government that says you'll be the first to know if there is, in fact, a power grid, given the historical context of not being forthcoming, of not being transparent when talking about issues truly plaguing Eskom?
Well, first of all, I would disagree with you in your point about the private investigation. I think it was completely inappropriate for Mr. De Ruyter to be taking money from a group that has vested interests, Business Leadership South Africa. Of course, business is a crucial role player in society, but nevertheless, they are an interest group, they are a lobby group, and they have no business funding an independent investigation into South Africa's most important public utility. So that was completely inappropriate, and it seems, in addition, that's produced very misleading intelligence. There's the one example everybody's probably aware of is this claim of some of these investigators that a highly sophisticated tracking device was found in Mr. De Ruyter's car. That was highly publicized by many media outlets without checking the details, and it was subsequently refuted by, pretty much every expert who knows anything about those things. So I disagree about the private investigation. It may well be true. Perhaps Mr. De Ruyter's motives were sincere. He may have been genuinely frustrated that he wasn't able to deal with crime and corruption and other kinds of issues within Eskom, but that wasn't an appropriate solution. With that said, the question, President Ramaphosa's statement, as a number of other people have noted, was kind of vacuous because, of course, if the grid collapses, South Africans will know about it very quickly, in some sense. But, if you have a full grid collapse, then one of the problems is that some of the mechanisms by which to communicate with citizens will also go down. I mean, the cell phone towers will stay up for a while, and then as batteries drain, they'll go down. So, look, I have no doubts personally about the president's motives. I don't think he intends to keep the country in the dark, so to speak. But it's kind of a vacuous statement, and understandably people are frustrated with such statements. It's been long enough. I think President Ramaphosa, he's had essentially, 4 to 5 years to address this problem. My view is that he was poorly advised at the outset. I think he's probably still is being poorly advised by people who are enthralled to vested interests. They've lost track of the public interest. But now, the situation just keeps getting worse. And so, every time I do an interview, the situation is worse. The options are closing down. And the big question now is that there are moves underway, to get new capacity onto the grid, including renewable energy. Those renewable energy projects are only going to come onto the grid in a year or 2 years or maybe 3 years' time. So then the question is, what's going to happen in the interim? And what's interesting is that, the options are really not very good. We have this car power ship proposal. There's concerns about corruption, and certainly the costs are not looking very appealing. But what's the alternative? To wait for the renewable energy to come onto the grid and deal with stage 6, 7, 8, 9 load shedding? That doesn't seem desirable either. Given that many analysts and institutions have pointed out the cost to the economy, one could say, well, it's justified for the fiscus, for public finances to pay that money in order to try and save the country from these higher stages of load shedding. But it's a terrible situation to be in. There are no good options, really. We should not have ended up in this situation. And I think it is fair to say that President Ramaphosa and his advisors and others have really failed the country in allowing us to reach this situation after 4 or 5 years of him being in charge.
Right. Well, Dr. Muller, thank you so much for coming onto our program and sharing your insights with us. That's Dr. Sean Muller, a senior researcher fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study.